The power to create money. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, said, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around will deprive the people of all property until the children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power of currency shall be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs." It is often said that one needs to follow the money to find out who controls or influences whom and what. You might be shocked that a handful of wealthy bankers have arrogated the power to create almost as much currency as they want out of thin air with a simple set of electronic accounting. They have surpassed the alchemist's dream of turning lead into gold. Imagine all the power and wealth they have acquired through this privilege of creating currency. It is a common misconception that currency is issued and controlled by governments. Little do we know that this control has long since passed into the hands of banking cartels. Indeed, the power to create currency is a mighty weapon to govern and influence major decisions. This social privilege must be given back to the people as a priority through an institution democratically governed by them, which will create money in exchange for the actual production of wealth. Many countries that claim to be democracies are oligarchies or plutocracies, in which power belongs to a minority of the rich and powerful who control the executive, legislative, judicial, media, and monetary systems. Most people do not understand what money is, let alone how the monetary system, which controls its issuance and circulation, works. The best way I've found to understand better how it works is to use, once again, the historical approach advocated by Aristotle. Everything becomes disconcertingly simple when one understands how money appeared, its functions, who created it, and how. We then understand the appearance and development of banks. One quickly realizes that this economic history, although so simple, has been made so complex to understand, probably to keep most citizens away and discourage them from looking into it. So how could we explain what money is and how it is created? To understand money, we must begin by imagining how it acquired its function as an instrument of exchange for products and services in the first human societies where it appeared. Humans, through the free investment of their time and efforts in activities such as hunting, gathering, fishing, herding, agriculture, the transformation of products and delivering of valuable services, build up a surplus of wealth, which they can exchange with others to obtain what they need or want. Several objects, which had functional or decorative intrinsic values, served as instruments of exchange and credit in the first human societies, such as shells, salt, wheat, or tea, and precious metals. Humans have needed an instrument that serves as 1. Intermediary to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. 2. Unit of account or measure of value to more easily determine the prices of goods and services. 3. Store of value, retaining its intrinsic value over a long period and not being rapidly perishable, like shellfish, salt, and precious metals like gold and silver. Money has also acquired the function of an instrument of transferring credit and debt. On the one hand, some need credit, and on the other hand, those who possess surplus wealth seek to invest it to make profits. Those who need credit can be of at least 3 types. 1. Entrepreneurs who wish to develop wealth-creating activities. 2. Governments that want to invest in social programs or infrastructures to increase citizens' well-being and protect nature. 3. Consumers who want to acquire goods and services they cannot afford because they don't produce enough wealth or increase their productivity. Those who have excess wealth and wish to grow it have 2 options. 1. Invest with entrepreneurs or public or private organizations that create wealth and share the risks, profits and losses with them. This option requires a careful study of investment projects. 2. Lend their money with usury. more recently called interest, without risk. They take collateral from the debtors, which they can sell if they cannot repay the loan with the usury charge on top. So why did the banks choose to lend with usury rather than invest with entrepreneurs and share the profits and losses? Even though usury has been banned in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam for its harmful effects on debtors and society, bankers and loan sharks have chosen to use it to enrich themselves massively at the expense of those who fall into debt. This practice contributed to widening the gap between the rich and the poor. Private banks' primary concern is maximizing profit through usury and not creating wealth to benefit the population. So how did bank and currencies come to be? In the first agricultural civilizations and in the societies that follow them, surplus wealth, like agricultural products, could be stored by temples, governments, or goldsmiths in their vaults, like gold and silver. These entities could issue certificates of deposit in the form of clay coins in Mesopotamia or later in the form of paper bills in China. The system was very convenient as long as people were confident that they could retrieve their stored wealth anytime. Moreover, it allowed people to use receipts as instruments of exchange for goods and services instead of carrying precious metals or other valuable goods that would be difficult to transport or divide. An instrument of exchange that has only the first two functions is called currency because it has no real intrinsic value. For example, gold and silver are money. Still, a banknote today is a currency because it is not a store of value. It doesn't keep its value in the long term because of perpetual inflation, which devalues it with time. Before, the banknote was a claim check corresponding to a quantity of gold and silver that could be retrieved from the bank. It was written on dollar bills. This is no longer true since the dollar bills have been detached from the bank's gold and silver reserves. To understand the monetary system, one must understand how banks came into being and how they developed. The first modern banks were established in the 14th century in the Italian cities of Florence, Venice, and Genoa during the early European Renaissance. In Italian, banco refers to the benches in which moneylenders and currency exchangers did business. Goldsmiths offers the service to the population to keep their gold and silver deposits in their vaults in exchange for a small fee. They also issued paper receipts that they gave to their consumers. The latter could recover the deposits by presenting these receipts. The merchants who made these deposits with the goldsmiths found that it was more convenient to exchange paper receipts with each other than to carry gold or silver with them. At the same time, the goldsmiths also realized that the merchants who deposited their gold and silver with them tended to leave them in their vaults for long periods. They began to issue bills as loans to other merchants who needed credit to start to expand their businesses. The goldsmiths provided them with the necessary credits and charged them usury, now called bank interest. As the profits became more and more lucrative and the goldsmiths more and more greedy, the latter decided to issue many more paper receipts or bills than they had gold and silver in their vaults to make even more loans with interest. The goldsmiths thus became the bank we know today, thanks to the fractional reserve concept. This allowed them to lend out almost 10 times the deposits in their vaults. When we deposit our money in the bank, we sign a contract that we send our money to the bank, and it can do with it as it pleases, in all sorts of investments or loans. Therefore, most of our deposits do not stay in the bank's vault. Only about 10% of deposits are stored there. If everyone came to collect their deposits simultaneously, the bank would fail and could not pay everyone back. This is called a bank run. Few people understand how banks create money. Commercial banks lend out something they create out of thin air and then require the borrowers to pay the capital plus interest for the privilege. These bank loans are usually secured because the banks require the borrower to put up collateral, such as their houses, which they can confiscate and sell if they fail to repay the loans. The principal amount is created when the loan is made, but the money to pay the interest due in subsequent periods has yet to be created. Thus, debtors are in an impossible situation because of having to pay back more money than is available in the market. Banks must always create more money through debt, thus imposing a growth imperative. That's why the global elite keeps insisting on the importance of growth. Borrowers who fail to repay their loans with interest, of course, end up losing their collateral. This is why the banking cartels need to ally with governments monopolizing violence in the territory. The government assumes the role of punishing those who fail to repay their bank loans and of saving the big banks from bankruptcy by buying up the non-repayable loans with taxpayer money. Governments would be willing to save big banks, but not the citizens who can't pay back their debts. Among the most interesting books on the subject is Talking to My Daughter About the Economy by Professor Yanis Varoufakis, former finance minister of Greece. In it, he explains the basics of the economic and monetary system in a simple and accessible way. There is also the work of Professor Thomas Greco. He asks fundamental questions about the true nature of money. Where does it come from? What role does it play in the functioning of our societies? Who should produce money? How should it be distributed? He manages to demystify the subjects that revolve around money, banking, and finance so that ordinary people can develop a big picture understanding of how the system works. He states that the way money is created today by the banking system causes a debt imperative, which in turn causes a growth imperative, which forces a destructive competition for the available money supply, which is never sufficient to allow the indebted to pay their debts. I also highly recommend the video on YouTube, Hidden Secrets of Money, produced and presented by Mike Maloney. Thanks to beautiful video animations, he explains what money is, its history, and how the monetary system works. Finally, there is an outstanding comic book and short cartoon series on YouTube entitled Fish, How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes. So what is the primary source of the dysfunction of the global capitalist system that causes these great economic crises and widens the gap between the rich and the poor? Many great economists have realized that one of the major causes of economic crisis is usury or bank interest. This practice makes those who own the wealth and the capital get richer and richer the more time passes without doing anything at the expense of the less fortunate who work for an hourly wage. They want to make money with bank interest instead of sharing the risks, like profits and losses, with the debtors. People who need help to get out of a personal financial crisis but will not necessarily produce wealth should be more eligible for welfare or charitable donations and certainly not bank loans. Thanks to Professor Greco's work, I understood the importance of rapidly developing ethical alternative banking and financial systems that do not practice usury and speculation but are based on risk sharing, such as Islamic finance. So how do banks influence governments, which are always ready to save them in case of bankruptcy? Banking cartels have proposed the creation of a central bank to political leaders who always need credit to launch expensive military campaigns and large infrastructure constructions. This Bank of Banks would have the monopoly and exclusivity of money creation and would be controlled by the banking cartel. In exchange, the central bank would have the right to produce as much currency as the political leaders wanted by purchasing bonds issued by the government through the intermediary of the big commercial banks that profit from these transactions. The banking cartels also ensure in this agreement with the government that the latter uses its monopoly of legitimate violence and the judicial system to punish those who create other currencies or do not pay back their debts. Here are some central banks and their date of creation. Bank of Amsterdam, 1609. The Central Bank of Sweden, 1664. The Bank of England, 1694. And the US Federal Reserve, 1913. The latter, despite its name, is not an agency of the US federal government, but a corporation with private shareholders. The entire network of central banks around the world is controlled by the Bank for International Settlements, based in Basel, Switzerland. So how could we explain how we went from systems where the money created is backed by its equivalent of gold and silver reserves to a system where the currency is entirely detached from them and can be controlled almost without limits? Mike Maloney explained in his video that from 1870 until the outbreak of the World War I in 1914, The basis of the international monetary system was the classical gold standard, in which each bank bill was backed by its equivalent weight in gold in the treasury. There were as many bills in circulation as gold reserves in the treasury. Each person holding a bank bill could go to the bank to claim its gold equivalent and receive it at any time. It was this 100% ratio that gave confidence in banknotes. During World War I, 1914 to 1917, many more banknotes were printed than there was gold in reserve to finance the war effort. The gold exchange standard replaced the era of the classical gold standard. Bank bills were then partially backed by their gold reserve equivalent under the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 when the U.S. Federal Reserve was created. For example, for every $40 of gold in reserve, the Federal Reserve could issue $100 of banknotes in circulation. So we have a 40% reserve ratio. During World War I and II, warring Europe paid the United States in gold in exchange for commodities such as wheat, oil, and war equipment. This is how the United States, which did not intervene militarily until near the end of the war, was able to amass 2/3 of the world's banking reserves of gold. Towards the end of World War II in 1944, a new world monetary system was put in place by the United States and its allies, the Bretton Woods system. As a result, the currencies of almost every country in the world became backed by the US dollar, which was backed by its gold reserves. It was the beginning of the dollar standard era. The United States began printing far more money than it had a gold equivalent in reserve and exporting its inflation worldwide, especially when it imposed on other countries that oil could only be bought or sold in US dollars after its deal with Saudi Arabia in 1974. In the 1960s, General de Gaulle, the president of France, announced that the United States did not have all the gold in reserve to cover the value of the dollars, with which they flooded the European and world markets. So he began to buy back American gold with France's dollars in reserve. Faced with the alarming decline of the Fed's gold reserves and the inability to exchange all the dollars of the countries that wanted to recover the gold, US President Nixon announced in August 1971 that he was temporarily, quotes, suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. This suspension was not temporary, as told, but permanent since it persists to this day. Now one can understand why and how central banks worldwide are creating more and more money out of thin air, or more and more currency, without worrying about the gold reserves. Doesn't that create a situation of inflation where prices can increase dramatically? The increase in the money supply is indeed one of the main reasons for inflation. Imagine that in a fast food market, there are only 2 Big Macs and $16 in circulation. The price of a Big Mac would then be $8. If the money supply in this market doubles, meaning we now have $32 in circulation, and the quantity of Big Macs stays the same, then the price of a Big Mac would double to become $16 each. The Big Mac index really exists, and it is a way of measuring the purchasing power parity between the currencies of countries by comparing the relative price to purchase McDonald's Big Mac. So what can we do to get out of this situation that causes great financial crisis with inflation that permanently increases the cost of living without increasing the population's purchasing power? As explained earlier, currency is created by commercial banks when individuals or organizations contract debts. The banks do not check whether these loans will be used to create wealth or not. All that matters to them is to recover these amounts and charge usury or interest on top. Instead, a democratically governed public investment agency could create money or currency belonging to the whole population and not just to wealthy bankers or corporations. This money or currency should be created to be exchanged with individuals and organizations for their wealth-creating products and services without charging interest. Currency must have its equivalent in gold and silver in reserve in the public investment agency. Any other currency created must be used only to finance wealth-creating projects. Credits can also be granted to entrepreneurs and organizations that want to start to expand their activities. The public investment agency will then have to study their projects and decide whether or not to invest and share the risks, like profits and losses, with them or not. Doing so ensure that currency is not created to finance overconsumption or speculation activities that do not create wealth. It might also be a good idea to separate the three functions that were granted to traditional banks. 1. Managing deposits. 2. Granting credit. 3. Offering a payment system that facilitates transactions. One of the books I recommend is Donuts Economics by the economist Kate Raworth, who teaches at Oxford University. It is one of the few books that help readers who do not necessarily have an economic background to discover and question the foundations of our financial systems. It also proposes a bold approach to designing economic systems from scratch. These alternative economic systems would focus on the well-being of all humans and the protection of nature rather than on growth imperatives. Another useful resource is Ray Dalio's animated video on YouTube entitled How the Economic Machine Works. Finally, the book Democracy at Work by the distinguished professor Richard Wolff is also an excellent resource to understand why and how it is crucial to democratize economic systems. As I study the psychology of human behavior and the history of power, I couldn't help but wonder, why isn't this knowledge taught in public schools? How can we educate the youth about the psychology, history, and strategies of power?